Welcome back. I'm the Intense MD, a double board certified intensivist, here to give you an inside look into the intensive care unit. This is my final May Mental Health Awareness Month video, and I decided to finish off just talking about my experience being an ICU doctor during the pandemic. In one way or another, everyone's been affected by the pandemic, and it has definitely weighed on our mental health. So I'm just going to talk about my personal experience at being an ICU doctor in the United States. This is not the experience of every doctor or every American. This is just my personal experience. I remember first hearing about COVID back in January, February 2020, and it was being talked about in the medical community as something that is a potential threat, but it was not in the United States as far as we knew, so it was something we were closely monitoring. In mid-February, I went to the National Society of Critical Care Medicine conference in Orlando, Florida. One of the seminars was about COVID. A lot of people at the conference were talking about COVID. This is a conference of people who work in the intensive care unit, so we were all very interested to hear about it, since we weren't sure if this was going to be something that would affect us, but we wanted to be prepared if it was. At the same time, it was a conference in Orlando, Florida, so I went to Disney World, I went to Harry Potter World. I lived my life like normal. About 2 weeks after coming back, we started having our first cases of potential COVID in our ICU. It feels like a lifetime ago, but at that time, the COVID test took almost a week to come back. We would have to send it off to the state health department, and there were not many tests being run, and wait several days to hear if the result was positive or negative. I still remember our first COVID patient, and one of the things that really struck me as a COVID patient in the intensive care unit is he was around my age. You hear all these things that people who are old or really sick are going to get sick from this, but when my first patient was somebody who was in my age group, I was like, oh, this really is affecting everyone. I clearly remember two separate things making me realize how much of a problem this was going to be. The first time was before it really hit the United States and it was starting to make its way across Europe. Seeing a photo of an Italian intensive care unit, every single patient was on their belly. This is a ventilation strategy that we use for severe respiratory illness. It's called proning. Proning's not uncommon, but it's not something we do with every patient, and it's not something we do every day. Usually during a bad flu season, we'll consider proning some patients, but seeing that photo where every single patient was proned, it really set the tone for me to say, oh wow, this is a major respiratory illness. And then the second time was a patient with COVID had received a lung transplant, and there was a photo of the lungs that were taken out of them that were published in a medical journal. And seeing what the lungs that had suffered through COVID looked like was impressive. I was very taken aback by seeing how much damage COVID had done to the lungs. And then, of course, at the beginning, there was a lot of fear because there were so many things we didn't know about the virus. We did not know how it was being spread. We didn't know who would be more or less affected by it. We didn't know how to treat it. New York City went into crisis, and shortly after, Seattle went into crisis. So a lot of the major cities were waiting to see who was going to be next. At the same time, there was a lot of misinformation being spread because things spread like wildfire through social media, through the news, just because there was so much unknown, but people wanted to get any information out there as soon as possible, that it was almost like information overload. There were a lot of Facebook groups for healthcare providers where we would share information with each other about treatments we were trying, because we were trying everything. We didn't know what the right thing to do was, so we just tried all different things. People were saying, hey, I tried these drugs, I've tried this strategy to oxygenate. There was this one specific print off which was written by a doctor in Seattle about everything that they tried for COVID, when they would consider intubation, what treatments they would consider, and when. And a lot of people kind of use this as a guideline. But as time went on, we learned that different things that we initially were using and thought worked were not working, and they were not saving lives. And like I said, there was a lot of fear going into this because I knew I was going to have exposure to COVID, and I kept seeing on Facebook all of these posts about physicians and nurses and nurse managers who were dying in New York City because of COVID. You just do everything to protect yourself. We had what kind of looked like space helmets. They're called cappers. I'll put a picture here at the hospital I was working at the time. And I would wear those for any patient that we considered to have COVID or was a person of interest with potential COVID. And when I got home from work, I would leave my scrubs in the garage. I took my shoes off. I would immediately take a shower. And I usually don't wash my hair every day, but I was washing my hair like every single day at that point because I just didn't know if it was still on me. A lot of people were carrying their cell phones in a Ziploc bag to prevent any particles from getting on their phone at work. I stopped wearing my wedding band to work, stopped wearing my Apple Watch around. I try to minimize what I brought to work. And I had a specific pair of shoes that I would wear to work and put them on and off in my garage. My husband is also a healthcare worker. He works with transplant patients, so I didn't want to get him sick, so he would get his patients sick. So, we were being very cautious at home as well. We just stopped going places like everybody. And of course, there were a lot of things in my personal life that I was sad to miss out on. I have not been home for a holiday in over a year. Easter was the first holiday in lockdown. And then this past year, Easter went by. I actually worked on Easter this year, but it was like, wow, I spent an entire year without going home for a holiday, which was a little jarring because when I was in med school, residency, fellowship, even when I was the busiest, I at least was able to go home for Christmas. So it was very just strange not being able to go home and do the things I'm used to doing with my family. There were major events that were either postponed or canceled. We were supposed to go on our honeymoon in May of last year. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. There's something else that happened during the pandemic was we moved. We moved from the East Coast and we lived driving distance from our families to Texas where we don't have family and we'd be flying distance. We moved in the middle of the summer and COVID was still a problem. One, finding a job during the pandemic was difficult, and that's a whole other story. But two, just really saying, wow, like I lived closer to family and friends and I didn't have the opportunity to see them because of lockdown, and then we've moved somewhere further away. Like I said, I started a new job. I started in September, and I think that the pandemic put, obviously stress on everyone, but particularly seeing these families who day in, day out were hoping for the best with their family member, even though they had irreversible lung injury, they were completely ventilator dependent. It was difficult having what felt like the same conversation multiple times a day, just giving bad news. I remember saying at work, I feel like I'm just a professional bad news giver. I don't feel like I'm helping any patients. I feel like I'm just sustaining and prolonging being the bearer of bad news, saying, this is irreversible, this is not fixable, and there's nothing we can do. These are conversations we have in the intensive care unit, but it's not typically every patient, every day, multiple times a day. Doing that over and over and over definitely took a toll. And another challenge was we had, like many hospitals, a strict visitor policy. We're trying to protect ourselves, our patients, and the visitors. So If the patient had COVID, they could not have any visitors, but if we were having a family meeting, the family can come in and meet us in the conference room and they can see the patient from outside the room. And of course, there was a lot of anger from the families and just a lot of despair that they couldn't be with them every day. It was just hard every day to, call patients' families to give them an update, and then the best I can offer them is a Zoom call to see their loved one attached to machines. And trying to explain the severity of their disease over the phone. I just felt bad having to tell them no, they can't come in, or no, they can't go in the room, and telling them no, there's nothing we can do. It's just really sad. So then in early December, we started hearing buzz about the vaccine. And I already made a video about my vaccine experience, so I'm not going to talk much about that here. But of course, it felt like it came out of nowhere. I knew that they were doing trials, but I didn't know how soon that they would apply for emergency use authorization and how quickly we would be getting the vaccine. So it did feel like some hope. And of course, there was a little bit of anxiety because I'm one of the first people to get the vaccine. I think more of my anxiety about the vaccine, I wasn't as concerned about side effects as I was of, does this really work? Or is this going to be a false sense of security and we're going to assume that we're all protected and then we loosen up precautions and we all get sick? Now we know the vaccine works. We have a lot more data on it, 6 months out. But at the time, there were just so many thoughts going through my head. But ultimately, it felt like hope because this is our step towards ending this. Getting to go to friends' weddings again, getting to go on my honeymoon, seeing my family again, being able to travel, being able to eat out at a restaurant, just all the things. It just felt like a little bit of hope when everything just felt so dark. And then right after I completed the vaccine series at the beginning of January, our post-holiday surge hit. It was like all the hope was immediately taken away because, at that point, not many people were vaccinated. A lot of people had traveled and seen each other for the holidays. And of course, many people got sick and needed to come to the hospital and be in the intensive care unit after the holidays. We went back to having more patients than we had ICU beds available, admitting multiple patients per day, emergently intubating several patients during the day, sometimes back to back, having many emergencies on the floor. The days were just so long and so busy, and it was chaos. I've been very grateful that our city has been very proactive with trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. I know that different states have had different barriers to vaccination. Fortunately, in Houston, we have had a very good vaccine rollout, and a lot of people have been able to be immunized. Because honestly, I've seen so much despair this past year. I've just seen a lot of sadness that I'm hopeful that this will end. I'm very hopeful that we won't have another surge, and I'm hoping that maybe this year I'll be able to go home for Christmas. Maybe I'll be able to go to my friend's wedding and resume life as we knew it before. There are just so many things I can talk about in this video about my experience this past year. So I'm trying not to talk about COVID a lot on my channel or the pandemic just because there are many other topics about critical care to cover. There are many physicians talking about COVID on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok already. I feel like it's oversaturated. It's not that I'm trying to avoid the topic. I just think that there's already a plethora of information out there. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I listened to a lot of podcasts of all different topics. But when this first started, a lot of the podcasts I listened to kind of had a special episode about COVID or lockdown, and it was early and it was what everybody was talking about was the hot topic. I was like, this is my whole day at work, and I usually listen to podcasts on my commute, so I don't want to listen about the pandemic on my way to and from work. So I had to take a break from my podcast. I kind of feel the same way right now talking about the pandemic. Like, I feel like there's a lot of content out there already, and I think sometimes we all just need a break from thinking about it. I know it's kind of ironic that I made a mental health video about COVID and then said I don't talk about COVID because of mental health reasons, but hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you want to hear more videos of this format, let me know. If you have any specific questions for me, I will be back on Tuesday with another video.